All right, welcome back to my high school football championship series, streaming live right here on Twitch and later uploaded to YouTube, depending on which platform you're watching this on. Make sure you like and subscribe to both so you don't miss any of the action. So we have made it to the end of the regular season, and we are now in round one of the playoffs that we're kicking off this week. So what we're going to do, I'm going to do a brief recap of the regular season. So let's go ahead and get to that, and then we'll get into the playoff games. So yeah, right before I do that though, let's do this. Just a quick reminder that all of the teams that you're seeing featured in this series are available for download and use in your College Football 26 video game. Simply search for my username down there at the bottom, and you can import any one of these custom made teams to use in your own game. Each team features 5 uniform options and custom rosters. Make sure that you're searching in the username search box and not the keyword search box. All right, so going back to the regular season, this is what week one looked like, and I'm just going to recap all of the games throughout the regular season. So in week one, we had Terrebonne defeating Morgan City by a score of 28-3. We had Thibodaux defeating HL Bourgeois by a score of 38-10. We had South Terrebonne defeating Central Lafourche by a score of 17-16, and we had Ellender defeating South Lafourche in a very close game that went to multiple overtimes by a score of 24-22. After that, we moved on to week two, where we saw Central Lafourche defeating HL Bourgeois by a score of 31-16. We saw South Terrebonne in a little bit of an upset, defeating Thibodaux by a score of 15-13 in a very close game. We saw Ellender handedly defeat Morgan City by a score of 38-7, and Terrebonne defeated South Lafourche by a score of 35-6. Moving on to week three, South Terrebonne defeats HL Bourgeois by a score of 7-0. Thibodaux drops their second game in a row, losing to South Lafourche by a score of 24-10 in a surprising upset there. South Lafourche defeats Morgan City by a score of 14-7, and Terrebonne remains undefeated by defeating Ellender by a score of 21-6. Going on to week four, we saw Terrebonne in a rivalry matchup against South Terrebonne, and Terrebonne comes out on top of that one by a score of 17-10. Thibodaux would bounce back from their previous two losses and defeat South Lafourche in another close game by a score of 13-10. Central Lafourche, in a surprising upset, loses to Morgan City by a score of 20-17 and would prove to be a very pivotal game later on in the season. And then Ellender defeats HL Bourgeois by a score of 30-7. Then we move on to week five, which was rivalry week for us. We had HL Bourgeois going into Terrebonne, losing a very close matchup, surprisingly very close. Terrebonne ekes out of that one by a score of 26-24. Thibodaux, in another close matchup, defeats Morgan City by a score of 23-20. South Terrebonne defeats Ellender by a score of 9-2 in a very interesting game there. And then South Lafourche beats their Central Lafourche rivals by a score of 24-20. All games were very, very close games that week. So an exciting rivalry week that we had. Then we moved on to week six. We had South Terrebonne defeating South Lafourche by a score of 28-14. We had Morgan City narrowly defeating HL Bourgeois by a score of 10-9. Thibodaux defeats Ellender by a score of 17-10. And then Terrebonne defeats Central Lafourche by a score of 33-18, which brings us to our final week of the regular season that we saw last week. South Lafourche hands HL Bourgeois their seventh loss of the season, defeating them 19-3, so HL Bourgeois remains winless. We had South Terrebonne defeating Morgan City by a score of 20-0. We had Terrebonne remaining undefeated, defeating Thibodaux by a score of 28-21, and then Ellender defeats Central Lafourche by a score of 21-13. So that brings us to our weekly standings here. And this is what we're looking at. This is what the teams have been set to. So Terrebonne with a perfect record of 7-0 has the number one spot. South Terrebonne, with their only loss to Terrebonne, holding that number two spot down. Both of those teams have earned themselves the bye week for this week. Thibodaux and Ellender round out 3 and 4, and of course, both of those teams with the same record, but Thibodaux owns the tiebreaker over Ellender, so Thibodaux gets the higher seeding in that ranking. Then we've got South Lafourche sitting in at number 5 with a record of 3 and 4. And then, like I said, that important game earlier in the season between Morgan City and Central Lafourche, since Morgan City beat Central Lafourche in their head-to-head matchup, that gave them the tiebreaker over Central Lafourche. So when they ended the season with the same record of 2-5, that meant Central Lafourche moves up in the ranking. They get the higher ranking and they eke into the playoffs just barely getting that last spot. So Morgan City is in these playoffs. HL Bourgeois, of course, remains winless there at the bottom. So what we are going to be seeing here, and just bear with me 1 second while I make a quick adjustment. Okay. What we're going to be seeing here tonight, I'm going to pull up the schedule, but we're going to be seeing the number 3. We got number 1 and number 2 with the bye week. Number 3 is going to be playing number 6, and number 4 is going to be playing number 5. That's how we're going to be doing this. And then, of course, the winners of those games, the lowest rated winner, the lowest ranked winner from those two matchups will go on to face Terrebonne, while the highest rated uh, winner will go on to face South Terrebonne in the next round. So here is our schedule for this week, first round of the playoffs. And we've got Morgan City going into Thibodaux to play Thibodaux, and then we're going to see South Lafourche going into Ellender to play Ellender, with Terrebonne and South Terrebonne having the bye weeks this week. All right, that pretty much does it for the recap. So let's go ahead and get into these games.